The morning light in September 1947 had a particular quality in Millbrook, Kansas, golden and thick as the wheat honey sold at Hutchins General Store. Our pharmacist, whose name matters less than his story, arrived at his drugstore at 6:45, as he had every morning for the past 9 years. The key turned in the lock with the familiar resistance that told him the humidity was dropping, autumn finally asserting itself over the prairie summer. Listen carefully, and you might hear what he heard: the satisfying click of his heels on the black and white checkered linoleum, the gentle protest of the ceiling fan as it began its daily rotation, the soft fizz from the carbonation tank beneath the marble soda fountain. These sounds were his morning prayer, his ritual of readiness. He moved through the store with practiced efficiency, raising the green canvas awnings, adjusting the window display of Sal Hepatica and Carter's little liver pills. His fingers, stained faintly yellow from years of handling iodine and sulfur compounds, arranged the prescription bottles on the shelf behind the counter. Each bottle found its place in the alphabetical symphony he'd inherited from his father: atropine, belladonna, codeine, digitalis. The soda fountain gleamed in the early light. 6 red leather stools stood at attention before the marble counter, and the pharmacist ran his cleaning cloth over the brass fixtures one more time. "Cleanliness is next to profit," his father used to say, though the old man had meant it as a joke. The phosphate dispensers caught the light like cathedral glass: cherry red, lemon yellow, chocolate brown, and that peculiar green of lime that never quite looked natural but sold well enough to the high school crowd. At 7 sharp, he flipped the sign in the door from closed to open and returned to his position behind the prescription counter. He pulled out the latest issue of the Journal of the American Pharmaceutical Association, though he'd barely read 2 paragraphs about new sulfanilamide compounds when the bell above the door chimed. Young Jimmy Mueller pushed through, all knobby knees and sun-bleached hair, carrying himself with the importance that only a 12-year-old with a regular job could muster. "Mornin', Mr. Pharmacist," the boy said, the title serving where a name would normally go. Small towns had their ways of addressing those who held certain positions: the pharmacist, the doctor, the sheriff, as if the role itself deserved more recognition than the individual filling it. "The usual?" our pharmacist asked, though he'd already reached for the tall phosphate glass. "Yes, sir. Mr. Whitmore's special phosphate. He says to tell you good morning, and that Martha sends her regards." The pharmacist's hand paused for just a moment. Martha Whitmore had been dead 2 years now, claimed by the pneumonia that took so many that winter of '45. But he said nothing, merely nodded and began his work. 2 pumps of cherry syrup, 1 of vanilla, a precise measure of acid phosphate for that characteristic tang, and then the special ingredient: a heaping spoonful of white powder from the unmarked tin that Tom Whitmore delivered weekly. The powder dissolved easily in the carbonated water, leaving no trace but that peculiar sweet smell that reminded him of something he couldn't quite place. Something from his botanical studies years ago at the Kansas City College of Pharmacy, perhaps. He stirred the concoction with a long silver spoon, the fizz rising and settling like tiny fireworks. "Tell Mr. Whitmore I'll need more of his special powder by Thursday," he said, securing the lid on the glass with practiced ease. Jimmy took the phosphate carefully, cradling it like communion wine. "He'll be pleased to hear it. Says this drink is the best thing that's happened to him since..." The boy trailed off, perhaps realizing the complexity of finishing that sentence. As Jimmy left, the morning sun caught the glass in his hands, turning the pink liquid to liquid ruby. The pharmacist watched him go, then returned to his journal, but the words about sulfanilamide seemed suddenly less interesting than the lingering sweet scent in the air. The bell chimed again. Mrs. Eleanor Hutchins swept in, her 58 years carried with the dignity of someone who'd been the first to know everything in Millbrook since 1920. Her diabetes brought her in regularly for insulin, but the pharmacist suspected information was her true addiction. "Good morning," she announced as if declaring the day officially begun. "I passed young Jimmy with another of those phosphates. Every morning, regular as clockwork. Strange devotion for an old farmer, wouldn't you say?" He measured out her insulin with steady hands. "People find comfort in routine, Mrs. Hutchins." "Routine?" She leaned across the counter conspiratorially. "Is that what we're calling it when a grown man claims to have conversations with his deceased wife? Just last night, I saw lights in the Whitmore farmhouse past midnight. Dancing lights, like someone was walking room to room with a lantern." Before he could respond, the door opened again. Doc Brennan entered, and even from across the store, the pharmacist could see the slight tremor in the physician's hands. 65 years old and still making house calls, though the tremor had been getting worse these past months. Their eyes met briefly, a moment of professional recognition. They both knew what the doctor needed, and they both knew it wasn't entirely medical. "Mrs. Hutchins," Doc Brennan nodded, his voice steady despite his shaking fingers. "Doctor," she replied, then gathered her insulin and departed, but not before adding, "You might want to check on old Ezra, Doc." All this talk about speaking with the dead can't be healthy. When she'd gone, Doc Brennan approached the counter. "The usual prescription," he said quietly. They both knew what that meant. Grain 1/4 morphine tablets, though the prescription had been written for 1/8. Small lies between medical men. Necessary accommodations to keep the doctor functional enough to serve the town. As the pharmacist prepared the prescription, he found himself thinking about Martha Whitmore's funeral. How Ezra had stood at the graveside like a scarecrow that had lost its purpose, hollow and ready to blow away with the next strong wind. Grief did strange things to people, but phosphates that brought messages from the dead? That was something else entirely. The morning wore on in its familiar rhythm. Prescriptions filled, sodas served, advice dispensed about everything from carbuncles to colic. But that sweet smell lingered, teasing at the edges of his memory like a word on the tip of his tongue. He'd identified hundreds of compounds by scent alone during his training. Why couldn't he place this one? 3 days had passed since Mrs. Hutchins mentioned the midnight lights, and our pharmacist found himself thinking about them as he polished the phosphate dispensers. September in Kansas brought shorter days, and by 6 in the evening, Main Street was already draped in the blue-gray light that preceded full darkness. He'd stayed late to balance the accounts, but his mind kept wandering to that unmarked tin of powder. The bell chimed and Jimmy Mueller appeared again, though this was unusual. His visits were strictly morning affairs. The boy's face was flushed with the importance of bearing extraordinary news. "Mr. Pharmacist, Mr. Whitmore wants to know if you could make 3 phosphates tomorrow instead of 1. He's having visitors, some men from the bank in Topeka." The pharmacist set down his polishing cloth, studying the boy's eager face. "That's quite an increase. Does he say why the sudden need?" Jimmy shifted his weight, clearly proud to be privy to adult information. "Well, sir, he says Martha told him something big is coming. Something about the farm's future. He wants to serve the bankers his special phosphate so they'll understand his, what did he call it? His connection to higher wisdom."
There it was again. Martha, speaking from beyond the grave. The pharmacist felt that particular unease that comes when reality begins to fray at the edges. He'd seen grief do terrible things to people, but this was systematic, orchestrated even. "Jimmy," he said carefully, "how long has Mr. Whitmore been talking to Martha?" The boy scratched his head, calculating. "Started about 6 months back, right after Mr. Tom came to help with the farm. Mr.
Whitmore says Martha came to him in a dream, told him the exact recipe for the phosphate, said if he drank it every morning at 8:15, that was her favorite time of day apparently, she'd guide him through important decisions. 6 months. The pharmacist filed this information away as Jimmy continued, the words tumbling out like water from a broken dam. "Mr. Tom says it's a miracle. Says his Aunt Martha was always the smart one. Knew about business and such. Now she's helping from heaven. Mr. Tom writes down everything she says. Well, everything Mr. Whitmore says she says. Fills up notebooks with it." The pharmacist walked to the unmarked tin, lifted the lid, and inhaled deeply. That sweet smell again, almost floral, with an undertone of something earthier. Where had he encountered it before? During his apprenticeship in Kansas City, perhaps, when old Professor Hartman made them identify every compound by smell alone? "Tell Mr. Whitmore I'll have 3 phosphates ready," he said finally. "But I'll need more of the special powder. This tin is nearly empty." "Mr. Tom will bring some tomorrow morning, first thing," Jimmy assured him, then darted out into the evening. Alone again, the pharmacist locked the front door and retreated to his back office, where his father's old books lined the shelves. He pulled down Remington's Practice of Pharmacy, its spine cracked from decades of use. But before he could begin his search, he heard knocking at the back door. Ruby stood there, still in her waitress uniform from the corner diner, her 24 years carrying more weight than they should. The war had taken her husband at Normandy, left her with memories and a modest pension that barely covered rent. "I'm sorry to bother you after hours," she began, but he waved her in. "Headache again?" She nodded, sinking into the chair across from his desk. "They come every evening now." Right about the time Henry used to come home from the fields. She caught herself, that reflexive use of present tense for someone 3 years gone. I mean, when he would have come home, he prepared her usual powder, aspirin with a touch of caffeine, while she talked. Ruby had this way of filling silence, as if quiet moments might allow too much thinking. "You know, Mrs. Hutchins says old Ezra Whitmore talks to his dead wife. Says she gives him advice and everything. Must be nice having that certainty. Sometimes I dream about Henry, and when I wake up for just a second I forget he's gone. That second is perfect. Then reality comes back like a slap." The pharmacist handed her the powder. "Grief has its own timeline," he said, though the words felt inadequate. "Mr. Tom Whitmore says his uncle found a way to beat grief," Ruby continued. "Says there's a scientific explanation for everything, even speaking to the dead." He was in the diner yesterday, going on about electrical impulses and brainwaves and how the departed leave traces we can access if we know how. "Tom Whitmore said that?" The pharmacist's interest sharpened. "Oh yes, quite the philosopher, that one. Though between you and me," she lowered her voice, "he gives me the shivers. Always watching people, calculating something behind that smile. And the way he hovers around his uncle, like a vulture waiting for—" She stopped, perhaps realizing the inappropriateness of the comparison. After Ruby left, the pharmacist returned to his books, but now with more purpose. Tom Whitmore. Failed businessman from Topeka, according to the letters he'd seen at the post office, moved in with his uncle 6 months ago. The same time the dreams started. The same time the special phosphates began. He found himself thinking about the nature of truth and comfort. What harm was there really if an old man found solace in a morning drink, and the belief his wife still guided him? The pharmacist had seen Doc Brennan function for years on carefully calibrated doses of morphine, had watched the town pretend not to notice because they needed a doctor. Every society had its comfortable lies. But there was something about that powder, that sweet smell that tugged at his memory like a fish on a line. He opened another reference book, this one on botanical compounds, and began working through it methodically. Aromatic compounds, essential oils, alkaloids. The clock on his desk showed 9:30 when he finally stopped, his eyes burning from the small print. Tomorrow he'd watch more carefully when he mixed the phosphate. Tomorrow he'd pay attention to how the powder behaved in solution, its dissolution rate, any unusual reactions with the acid phosphate. As he locked up and walked home through the quiet streets, he passed the Whitmore farm in the distance. Sure enough, lights flickered in the windows. Not electric lights, but the warm, unsteady glow of oil lamps moving from room to room. He thought about Ezra, probably preparing for his 8:15 appointment with Martha's ghost, and Tom, probably preparing the next batch of special powder. The night air carried the smell of burning wheat stubble from the fields, that end-of-harvest tradition that cleared the land for next year's planting. But underneath it, so faint he might have imagined it, was that same sweet scent from the powder. It was then, standing on the dark street with the taste of smoke and mystery in his mouth, that he remembered where he'd encountered that smell before. Professor Hartman's toxicology class, 1924, a lecture on plants that could alter the mind. Tom Whitmore arrived at 7:15 the next morning, carrying a canvas satchel that bulged with suspicious angularity. Our pharmacist watched him approach through the storefront window. 31 years old, hair slicked back with too much brilliantine, wearing a suit that had seen better days, but was pressed with desperate precision. Everything about Tom suggested a man trying to outrun his own shadow. "Good morning," Tom said, though his smile never quite reached his eyes. He set the satchel on the counter with exaggerated care. "Jimmy mentioned you needed more of Uncle's special ingredient." The pharmacist nodded, maintaining the neutral expression that served him well in all transactions. Tom produced not one, but 3 unmarked tins, each the size of a tobacco container, sealed with wax around the edges. "This should last you through the month," Tom said, then leaned forward conspirationally. "Uncle's having more episodes lately, more conversations. Sometimes twice a day now. Martha has so much to tell him, apparently." There was something in the way he said Martha, a slight pause before the name, as if he were suppressing a smirk. The pharmacist took one of the tins, broke the wax seal, and lifted the lid. The sweet smell rose immediately, stronger than before, almost cloying in its intensity. "Interesting aroma," the pharmacist observed. "What exactly is this powder? For my records, you understand. The state board has been asking more questions lately about unmarked ingredients." Tom's face tightened, almost imperceptibly. "Oh, it's perfectly harmless. A combination of dried herbs and minerals. Uncle says Martha gave him the exact formula in that first dream. Chamomile, a touch of valerian for calm, some crushed calcium for bone health. Old woman's recipe, really. Nothing that would interest the state board."
Chamomile and valerian didn't smell like this. The pharmacist had worked with both for decades,
but he merely nodded, making a show of writing herbal compound in his ledger. "Uncle's been talking about updating his will," Tom continued, his casual tone clearly rehearsed. "Martha's been quite insistent about it, apparently. Says the farm needs to stay in capable hands, someone with vision for the future. Modern farming methods, mechanization, that sort of thing." The pharmacist measured out a portion of the powder, noting how fine it was ground, almost like talcum, but with tiny fibrous pieces throughout. Someone had put considerable effort into this preparation. "Your uncle seemed content with his current arrangements, last I heard," the pharmacist said carefully. "That was before Martha started advising him. She sees things we can't, being on the other side and all. She knows I came here to help, that I've got plans for the property. 2,000 acres could be so much more than wheat fields."
Martha understands progress. The way Tom spoke about his dead aunt as if she were a business partner, rather than a voice from beyond, struck the pharmacist as particularly cold. But then, perhaps that was the nature of exploitation. It required a certain emotional distance. Doc Brennan entered then, interrupting their conversation. This morning his tremor was worse, his face pale and drawn. The pharmacist recognized the signs of withdrawal. The doctor was trying to reduce his morphine intake again. "Gentlemen," Doc Brennan nodded, then focused on Tom. "Your uncle missed his appointment yesterday. His heart condition requires regular monitoring." Tom waved dismissively. "Uncle's never felt better. Martha's guidance has given him a new lease on life. He says he doesn't need doctors anymore, just his morning phosphate and his evening conversations." Doc Brennan's eyes narrowed. "Ezra has atrial fibrillation."
"Ignoring it won't make it disappear, no matter what he thinks he hears." "What he knows he hears," Tom corrected, his voice taking on an edge. "Just because medical science can't explain everything doesn't mean it isn't real, Doctor. Perhaps if you were more open-minded." The tension in the drugstore thickened like humidity before a storm. The pharmacist intervened smoothly, handing Doc Brennan his prescription while guiding Tom toward the door. "I'll have those 3 phosphates ready for the bankers," he assured Tom. 8 o'clock sharp." After Tom left, Doc Brennan lingered, his shaking hands struggling with the prescription bottle's cap. The pharmacist helped him, their fingers briefly touching. The doctor's skin was cold, clammy. "That young man is poison," Doc Brennan said quietly. "I've seen his type before, during my residency in Chicago. They prey on the vulnerable, the grieving, always with a smile and a reasonable explanation." The pharmacist wanted to ask more, but Mrs. Hutchins burst through the door with her usual dramatic timing. "Did you hear?" she announced breathlessly. "Ezra Whitmore is planning to sign over half his property to Tom. The county clerk's wife told me this morning. Tom's been down there 3 times this week, checking on inheritance laws and property transfers." Doc Brennan shook his head slowly. "Ezra would never. That land has been in the Whitmore family for 60 years. "Well, apparently Martha thinks differently," Mrs. Hutchins said with obvious skepticism. Martha, who coincidentally shares all of Tom's opinions about modernization and progress. Funny how the dead become so concerned with real estate transactions. After they left, the pharmacist locked the front door and carried one of the tins to his back office. He had 2 hours before the bankers arrived, 2 hours to solve a puzzle that had been nagging at him since last night's memory of Professor Harkman's toxicology class. He spread a small amount of the powder on a glass slide, and examined it under his microscope. The structure was definitely plant-based. He could see cellular walls, tiny seed fragments, and what looked like dried flower petals ground to near dust. But there was something else, a crystalline substance coating everything like frost. From his locked cabinet, he retrieved his testing reagents, solutions and chemicals he rarely used but kept for moments like this. A drop of Marquis reagent on the powder produced a slow color change from clear to yellow to orange. His pulse quickened. He tried another test, then another, each result pointing to the same conclusion. The sweet smell, the fibrous texture, the reaction to the reagents, it all pointed to one plant. Datura stramonium, Jimson weed, devil's trumpet, a powerful hallucinogen that grew wild all over Kansas, its beautiful white flowers hiding a dangerous secret. In small doses, it could cause auditory hallucinations, voices where there were none, messages from the silence. He thought about Ezra, drinking his phosphate each morning at exactly 8:15, the datura building up in his system day by day. At that dosage, carefully controlled, it wouldn't cause full delirium, just suggestions. Whispers that sounded like his dead wife, advice that coincidentally aligned with his nephew's interests. The pharmacist sat back in his chair, the weight of knowledge settling on his shoulders like a lead apron. He was complicit now, had been since the first phosphate he'd mixed. But what could he do? Accuse Tom without proof? Tell Ezra his cherished conversations with Martha were chemically induced delusions? The clock showed 7:45. The bankers would arrive soon, expecting their special phosphates. He thought about replacing the powder with something harmless, but Tom would know immediately. Men like Tom always knew when their plans were threatened. Instead, he prepared the 3 drinks exactly as requested, each movement mechanical, automatic. As he worked, he made a decision. He would gather evidence, document everything. He would protect Ezra Whitmore, even if it meant protecting him from his own desperate need to believe his wife still spoke to him. The pharmacist's house stood 3 blocks from Main Street, a modest 2-story Victorian that had belonged to his father before him. That evening, he climbed the narrow stairs to the attic, where decades of pharmaceutical journals and reference books gathered dust in neat rows. The October wind rattled the windows as he searched for a particular volume, his father's botanical reference from 1898, with its detailed illustrations and meticulous notes in the margins. Listen to the sounds of discovery, the whisper of turning pages, the scratch of his pencil on paper, the occasional sharp intake of breath when a piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Under the yellow light of a single bulb, our pharmacist became a detective, piecing together a crime that existed in the gray space between legal and moral. He found what he was looking for on page 312, Datura stramonium, illustrated in loving detail, the trumpet-shaped flowers, the spiny seed pods, the broad leaves. His father's handwriting in the margin. Extremely dangerous. 1/10 grain can cause hallucinations. Half grain, potentially fatal. Growing wild along Creek Road and behind the old Whitmore barn. Behind the old Whitmore barn. The coincidence was too perfect, too convenient. Tom hadn't needed to import his weapon. It had been growing there all along, waiting for someone clever enough to recognize its potential. The pharmacist copied the relevant passages, his own handwriting careful and precise. he noted the symptoms of datura poisoning: dilated pupils, dry mouth, confusion, and most significantly, auditory hallucinations that could seem completely real to the victim. In the right doses, a person could function almost normally while hearing voices that didn't exist. A memory surfaced from pharmacy school. Professor Hartman describing a case from the 1880s where a woman poisoned her husband slowly with datura tea, convincing him that God was speaking to him, commanding him to sign over his shipping business to her brother. The plan only failed because she grew impatient, increased the dose too quickly, and the man fell into obvious delirium that even a 19th century doctor could recognize. Tom was more careful, more patient. 6 months of daily doses, carefully calibrated, never enough to cause obvious symptoms, but sufficient to maintain a steady state of suggestion. Brilliant in its simplicity, horrifying in its calculated cruelty, the pharmacist descended to his kitchen, poured himself 2 fingers of bourbon, a rare indulgence, and sat at his table to think. Through his window, he could see the lights of Millbrook spreading out like a constellation of ordinary lives. How many of them carried secrets like this? How many pleasant facades hid desperate schemes? He thought about his conversation with the bankers that morning. They'd been impressed by Ezra's certainty, his claims of divine guidance through his departed wife. One of them, a thin man with calculating eyes, had mentioned that such devotion to family was admirable in these modern times. They'd approved whatever loan Tom had been angling for, contingent on the property transfer being completed. The bourbon burned pleasantly as he considered his options. He could go to Sheriff Dalton, but with what evidence? That he'd identified a plant substance in a drink he'd been serving for months? He'd implicate himself as much as Tom. He could confront Tom directly, but men backed into corners did dangerous things, and Tom had already shown his willingness to exploit the vulnerable. The telephone rang, startling him from his contemplation. Ruby's voice came through, tired and strained. "I'm sorry to call so late, but could you open the store? It's not for me, it's Doc Brennan. He's having difficulties." He found them in the alley beside the drugstore 20 minutes later. Doc Brennan was sitting on the ground, his back against the brick wall, trembling violently. Ruby knelt beside him, her waitress uniform still smelling of coffee and fried food from the diner. "Withdrawal," Doc Brennan gasped between shaking breaths. "Tried to stop too quickly. Stupid, stupid." The pharmacist unlocked the back door, and together they helped the doctor inside. In his office, he prepared a small dose of morphine, just enough to ease the worst symptoms. As the trembling subsided, Doc Brennan's eyes cleared, shame replacing agony. 40 years of medicine, the doctor whispered, and I can't even heal myself. "Healing takes time," the pharmacist replied, thinking of Ezra and his poisoned grief, "and sometimes we need help seeing the truth." Ruby made coffee on the small burner the pharmacist kept for preparing tinctures. As they sat in the dim office, an unlikely trio brought together by small-town proximity and shared secrets, Doc Brennan began to talk. "I started during the influenza outbreak of 18, he said. "So many dying, not enough hands, never enough sleep. The morphine kept me going, kept me functional. Then the crisis passed, but the need didn't. 40 years of carefully measured doses, telling myself it was medicinal, necessary. We all have our phosphates," the pharmacist said carefully, testing whether the doctor would understand the reference. Doc Brennan looked at him sharply.
Some phosphates are more dangerous than others. Some are designed to trap rather than treat. They sat in silence for a moment, each understanding more than they said. Finally, Ruby spoke. My Henry used to say that the truth was like water. It always finds its way through, no matter how many barriers you put up. Maybe that's what we need here. More truth and less comfortable lies. The pharmacist thought about the Jimson weed growing behind the Whitmore barn, about Tom's calculated patience, about Ezra's desperate need to believe his wife still guided him. Truth was indeed like water, but sometimes it could drown those not prepared to swim in it. I've been thinking, Doc Brennan said slowly, about my oath to do no harm. Does that mean only physical harm? What about letting someone's mind be poisoned while their body remains healthy? It was near midnight when they finally parted ways. The pharmacist walked home through streets so quiet he could hear his own heartbeat. In his pocket, the notes about Datura seemed to pulse with significance. Tomorrow, he decided, he would visit the Whitmore farm. He would see the Jimson weed for himself, gather evidence that couldn't be dismissed as speculation. As he prepared for bed, he found himself thinking about the nature of belief and deception. Every prescription he filled required trust. Trust that he'd measured correctly. Trust that he'd identified the right compound. Trust that he had the patient's best interests at heart. Tom had violated that trust, turned medicine into manipulation. But there was something else troubling him, something Ruby had said about comfortable lies. How many of his customers relied on placebos he knowingly dispensed? Sugar pills for hypochondriacs, colored water for those whose ailments were more spiritual than physical. Was he so different from Tom? Or was it only a matter of degree? The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows like someone trying to get in. Or perhaps, he thought, as sleep finally took him, like something trying to get out. The truth, patient and persistent, wearing away at the barriers that contained it. The Whitmore farm sprawled across the horizon like a golden sea frozen in time. Our pharmacist arrived at 3 in the afternoon, ostensibly delivering a month's supply of Ezra's heart medication that Doc Brennan had prescribed before the old man stopped believing in doctors. The October sun cast long shadows across the wheat stubble, and the air carried that particular autumn smell of dried grain and distant smoke. The farmhouse itself was a testament to better times. 3 stories of Victorian ambition with a wraparound porch that had seen countless summer evenings and family gatherings. Now, paint peeled from its shutters like old skin, and several windows on the 3rd floor were boarded over. Decline had come slowly, then all at once after Martha's death. Ezra answered the door himself, and the pharmacist was struck by the change in him. The old man's pupils were dilated despite the bright afternoon light, a telltale sign of datura poisoning that Doc Brennan would have recognized immediately. His clothes hung loose on his frame. He'd lost perhaps 20 pounds since spring. Come in, Ezra said, his voice carrying an unusual tremor of excitement. Martha said you'd be coming today. She knows things, you understand, sees the patterns we miss. The front hallway smelled of dust and something else, that sweet, cloying scent the pharmacist now recognized all too well. Tom appeared from the parlor, a ledger in his hands, his expression shifting from annoyance to calculated welcome. Our faithful pharmacist, Tom said, though his smile had edges sharp enough to cut.
Uncle was just telling me about Martha's latest insights.
Fascinating stuff about the future of agriculture. They moved to the parlor, where the furniture was covered in white sheets like ghosts of prosperity. Ezra sat in the only uncovered chair, a leather wingback that had probably been his favorite for decades. On the side table, the pharmacist noticed 3 empty phosphate glasses and a notebook filled with Tom's handwriting. "She speaks to me clearest in the evening," Ezra explained, his eyes focused on something beyond the room. "Right around sunset, when the light goes purple over the wheat. That was her favorite time, you know. We'd sit on the porch and plan the next season, discuss the children we never had, dream about the future." Tom watched his uncle with the patience of a spider watching a fly struggle in its web. "Tell him about the new will, Uncle. Tell him what Martha advised." Ezra nodded eagerly. "She's very clear about it. The farm needs someone with vision, someone who understands progress." Tom has plans for irrigation, mechanization. Martha says the old ways are dying, that we must adapt or perish. The pharmacist set down the medicine bottle, noting how Ezra's hands shook slightly as he reached for it. "When did Martha first start giving you business advice?" "6 months ago, right after Tom arrived. She knew he was coming, told me in a dream to prepare the special phosphate. Said it would open channels between us. Let her guide me through the difficult decisions ahead." Tom interjected smoothly, "Uncle's always been sensitive to the spiritual realm. Martha's just taking advantage of that gift to help from beyond." "I'd like to see the barn," the pharmacist said suddenly. "I remember your father kept his pharmacy supplies there during the influenza outbreak. Historical interest, you understand." Tom's eyes narrowed, but Ezra stood immediately. "Of course. Martha would want you to see. She mentions you sometimes, says you're a careful man, trustworthy." They walked through the kitchen, where the pharmacist noticed several mason jars filled with dried plant material on the windowsill. Tom followed closely, his presence a constant pressure. The barn stood 100 yards from the house, its red paint faded to the color of dried blood. Behind the barn, exactly where his father's notebook had indicated, the Jimson weed grew in wild profusion. The plants were chest-high, their seed pods split open, revealing the dark seeds inside. Someone had been harvesting them recently. Several plants showed fresh cuts where pods had been removed. "Nasty weeds," Tom said casually. "Keep meaning to clear them out, but Uncle says Martha lacks them. Says they're pretty when they bloom." The pharmacist knelt, pretending to tie his shoe, and palmed several seeds and a dried leaf. Evidence, finally, concrete and undeniable. When he stood, he found Ezra staring at the plants with an expression of confused recognition. "These look familiar," the old man said slowly. "Martha used to warn me about them when we first bought the farm. Said they were poison, dangerous for the cattle." "Martha's changed her mind about many things," Tom said quickly, taking his uncle's arm. "Remember, she said everything has its purpose, even the weeds." They returned to the house as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. The light was indeed turning purple over the wheat fields, and Ezra became increasingly agitated, eager for them to leave. "She'll be here soon," he explained. "She doesn't like strangers present for our conversations. Gets jealous, you understand. Even in death, Martha was always particular about her privacy." As the pharmacist drove away, he saw Tom in his rearview mirror, standing on the porch, watching. The message was clear. Tom knew he knew, and now they were playing a different game, one with higher stakes. That evening, he spread his evidence on his desk, the seeds, the leaf, his notes, the passages from his father's book. He had enough to go to Sheriff Dalton, but something held him back. It wasn't fear of Tom exactly, but rather a deeper concern for Ezra. What would happen when the old man learned his conversations with Martha were nothing but chemical delusions? Some truths were like medicine themselves, healing in the right dose, poisonous in excess. He thought about Doc Brennan's slow withdrawal from morphine, how the doctor needed to step down gradually or risk collapse. Perhaps the same was true for Ezra. Perhaps the kindest thing would be to slowly dilute the datura, let reality seep back in gradually rather than all at once. The phone rang. Mrs. Hutchins's voice was breathless with scandal. "Have you heard?
Ezra Whitmore just announced he's signing over half the farm to Tom tomorrow. The whole town's talking about it. Says Martha insists it happened before the harvest moon. That's in 3 days." The timeline had accelerated. Tom was getting impatient, or perhaps worried about discovery. Either way, the pharmacist realized he had less time than he'd thought. He looked at the Jimson weed seeds on his desk, these tiny vehicles of deception, and made his decision. Tomorrow, he would prepare Ezra's phosphate as usual, but with one crucial difference. He would replace the datura with harmless herbs that looked identical when ground. Let Tom wonder why Martha's voice grew fainter. Let Ezra begin the slow journey back to reality. It was a risk. Tom might realize immediately, might retaliate. But the alternative, watching a good man sign away his life's work under the influence of a poison his nephew fed him daily, that was intolerable.
Outside, the harvest moon was rising, full and orange as a phosphate glass held up to the light. The preparation began at 5 in the morning, while Millbrook still slept under a blanket of prairie fog. Our pharmacist worked by lamplight in his back office, grinding dried chamomile and valerian root to the exact consistency of Tom's datura powder. His mortar and pestle, inherited from his father, who'd inherited it from his, moved in steady circles, reducing the harmless herbs to a fine dust that would fool the eye, if not the body. Listen to the rhythm of deception being unmade, the soft grinding of stone on stone, the whisper of powder falling through a fine sieve, the careful scratch of labels being written and rewritten. He was creating an antidote, not just to poison, but to the cruelty of manipulated grief. He thought about the letter he'd composed last night and mailed to a colleague at the Kansas City College of Pharmacy, describing the situation in careful, hypothetical terms. The response would take days to arrive, but he needed another professional opinion, someone to confirm his diagnosis and perhaps suggest a path forward that didn't end with accusations and arrests. At 6:30, he heard familiar footsteps on the sidewalk. Jimmy Mueller, early as always, eager for his morning responsibility. The pharmacist quickly sealed his substitute powder in an unmarked tin identical to Tom's, placing it behind the counter just as the boy pushed through the door. "Morning, Mr. Pharmacist," Jimmy said, but his usual enthusiasm was dampened. "Mr. Whitmore had a bad night. Tom says he was up until dawn, arguing with Martha about something. Couldn't make out the words through the door, but it sounded serious." The pharmacist prepared the phosphate with special care, using his substitute powder instead of Tom's poison. The drink looked identical, the same pink foam, the same cherry vanilla scent masking any other odors. but it would deliver no visions, no voices from beyond. "Tell Mr. Whitmore, I hope he feels better," he said, handing over the glass. An hour later, Doc Brennan arrived, looking healthier than he had in months. His hands were steady as he examined a prescription bottle, turning it to read the label in the morning light. "I've been thinking about our conversation," the doctor said quietly, "about different kinds of harm and the obligations of our profession. I've decided to report my own addiction to the state medical board. If I'm going to get clean, truly clean, I need accountability." The pharmacist felt a mixture of admiration and concern. "That's brave, but they might suspend your license." "They might," Doc Brennan agreed. "But living a lie is its own kind of poison. I've been medicating myself for 40 years, telling myself it was necessary, that the town needed me functional. But what they really need is a doctor they can trust completely." Before the pharmacist could respond, Tom Whitmore burst through the door. His usual composure cracked like a broken window. His hair was disheveled, his tie askew. "What did you do to the phosphate?" he demanded, slamming his palms on the counter. The pharmacist maintained his calm, years of dealing with agitated customers serving him well. "I prepared it exactly as always. 2 pumps cherry, 1 vanilla, acid phosphate, and your powder." Uncle didn't hear anything. For the first time in 6 months, Martha was silent. "You switched something." Perhaps Martha had nothing to say, the pharmacist suggested mildly. Even the dead must rest sometimes. Tom's face flushed red, then went pale as he realized the implications. They stood there, 2 men separated by a counter and an understanding of what each knew about the other. Doc Brennan watched from the corner, a witness to this careful dance of accusation and denial. "You're going to fix this," Tom said, his voice low and dangerous. "You're going to make the phosphate correctly, or I'll tell everyone in town that you've been poisoning their medicines. Who do you think they'll believe? The nephew caring for his sick uncle, or the pharmacist who's been secretly addicting the whole town?" It was a desperate threat, but not without teeth. Small towns ran on reputation and trust. A few well-placed rumors could destroy a business that had stood for 50 years. "Interesting theory," the pharmacist replied. "Of course, if there were any truth to it, you'd be admitting you knew about the poisoning, that you supplied the poison. That would make you complicit, wouldn't it?" They were interrupted by Ruby entering with the morning coffee service. She'd started bringing fresh coffee from the diner ever since she'd noticed the pharmacist's ancient percolator produced something closer to tar than beverage. "Everything all right?" she asked, sensing the tension. "Just discussing Uncle Ezra's prescription," Tom said, forcing his face back into its usual mask of concern. "He had a difficult night." Ruby set down the coffee, but her eyes remained on Tom. "Mrs. Hutchins says the property transfer is tomorrow. The whole town's planning to witness it at the courthouse. Such a generous thing, sharing the farm with family." "Martha's idea," Tom said automatically, though the words seemed to stick in his throat. "She always was generous." After Tom left, with threats of returning for the evening phosphate, Doc Brennan approached the counter. "You substituted the powder," he said. It wasn't a question. The pharmacist nodded slowly. "Primum non nocere. First, do no harm. Tom won't let this stand. Men like him, when cornered..." Doc Brennan trailed off, but his meaning was clear. The rest of the day passed in a strange, suspended state. Customers came and went. Prescriptions were filled. Sodas were served. But the pharmacist's mind was elsewhere, calculating possibilities and probabilities. He thought about Ezra, probably confused by Martha's sudden silence. Would the old man feel relieved or abandoned? Would Tom increase the dose, try to force the hallucinations back? Mrs. Hutchins arrived at 4, bursting with news. Ezra's postponed the signing, says he needs to think more clearly, that something feels wrong. Tom's beside himself, pacing the courthouse steps like a caged animal. The pharmacist felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. The substitution was working. Without the datura, Ezra's mind was beginning to clear. But a desperate Tom was a dangerous Tom. That evening, as he prepared to close the store, he found an envelope slipped under the back door. Inside, a single sheet of paper with Tom's handwriting. "You've made a terrible mistake. Uncle's heart can't take the shock of Martha leaving him again.
When he dies from the grief you've caused, his blood will be on your hands."
The pharmacist sat in his office as darkness settled over Millbrook, weighing the thread. Was Tom planning something more direct, or was this just the thrashing of a scheme coming undone? He thought about his father, who'd run this pharmacy for 30 years before him, dealing with his own moral complexities during Prohibition, when medicinal alcohol was the only legal drink in town. His father had kept a detailed journal, documenting every prescription, every decision, creating a record that could stand up to scrutiny. The pharmacist pulled out his own journal and began to write, documenting everything: the phosphates, the datura, Tom's threats, his own substitution. If something happened to him or to Ezra, there would be a record. The truth would survive, even if he didn't.
The courthouse steps were crowded at 9 in the morning. Half of Millbrook gathered to witness what they assumed would be a straightforward property transfer. Our pharmacist stood near the back, having closed his store for the first time in 5 years. The October air was sharp with the promise of frost, and the crowd's breath formed small clouds of anticipation in the cold morning light. Ezra Whitmore arrived in his best suit, the one he'd worn to Martha's funeral, now hanging loose on his diminished frame. But something was different about him today. His eyes were clearer, more focused, though touched with a profound confusion. Tom walked beside him, one hand on his uncle's elbow, the very picture of nephew's devotion, though the pharmacist could see the tension in his jaw, the barely controlled fury in his movements. Sheriff Dalton stood by the courthouse door, his presence official, but his attention clearly focused on the Whitmores. The pharmacist had spoken with him briefly the night before, sharing just enough concern to warrant watching, not enough to demand action. "Before we go in," Ezra announced suddenly, his voice carrying across the crowd, "I need to say something." Tom's grip on his uncle's arm tightened visibly. "Uncle, Martha said—" "Martha's been quiet for 3 days now," Ezra interrupted, and a murmur ran through the crowd. "For 6 months, she's guided me, advised me, comforted me. But 3 days ago, she stopped. And in that silence, I've started to remember things. Disturbing things." The pharmacist watched Tom's face cycle through calculations, weighing options, measuring risks. The crowd pressed closer, sensing drama beyond the simple signing of papers. Mrs. Hutchins, never one to miss an opportunity, called out, "What kind of things, Ezra?" The old man turned toward her voice. "Martha warned me about Jimson weed when we first bought the farm. Said it was devil's trumpet, could make people see and hear things that weren't there. She made me promise to keep it cleared out, but it's growing wild behind the barn now, has been for months." Tom laughed, but it was forced, theatrical. "Uncle's been under stress, the grief, you understand. Sometimes he gets confused."
"I'm not confused about this," Ezra said firmly. "Yesterday, when Martha stayed silent, I went to the library, found a book about plants, Datura stramonium. Says right there it causes hallucinations, especially auditory ones. Says it's been used throughout history to deceive people, make them think they're hearing voices from God or the dead." The crowd's murmur grew louder. The pharmacist saw Doc Brennan push through from the side, medical bag in hand, as if anticipating a need for his services. Tom's mask finally slipped completely. "You're sick, Uncle. Your heart, remember? The strain of losing Martha, it's affected your mind." "These conspiracy theories then explain this," Ezra said, pulling a notebook from his coat. "Your handwriting, Tom. Pages and pages of Martha's advice, all in your hand. But here's the interesting part. I found your practice pages in the barn. Different versions of the same messages, like you were rehearsing what Martha would say." Sheriff Dalton stepped forward, his interest officially engaged. "Mr. Whitmore, are you making an accusation?" Before Ezra could answer, Tom bolted. He didn't get far. 31 years of city living hadn't prepared him for outrunning Kansas farm boys who'd joined the crowd. They brought him back, disheveled and spitting denials. "He's senile," Tom shouted. "Ask anyone. He's been talking to his dead wife for months. Who's going to believe a crazy old man over his caring nephew?" It was then that our pharmacist stepped forward, pulling his journal from his coat. "I believe him," he said quietly, but his voice carried. "I've been documenting the phosphates Tom had me prepare, the special powder he provided. I tested it 3 days ago. It's Datura, Jimson weed, ground fine and mixed with calcium powder to disguise the taste." The crowd recoiled as if from a physical blow. In small towns, poisoning was the worst kind of betrayal, a violation of the basic trust that let neighbors share meals and medicines. "You prepared them," Tom accused, pointing at the pharmacist. "You're the one who's been poisoning him." "I prepared them," the pharmacist agreed calmly, "until 3 days ago when I substituted harmless herbs. That's why Martha went silent, Mr. Whitmore, because she was never there. It was the Datura, making you susceptible to suggestion, making Tom's whispered words sound like your wife's voice." Ezra sank onto the courthouse steps, his face a map of grief renewed. Doc Brennan knelt beside him, checking his pulse, murmuring medical reassurances. The old man wasn't looking at Tom anymore, wasn't looking at anyone. He was staring at something none of them could see. The real Martha, perhaps, or just the empty space where his delusions had lived. "She felt so real," Ezra whispered. "Her voice, her words, even the things she said about the farm, about modernization, they sounded like her. Progressive, but practical. How did you know what she would say?" Tom, held by 2 farmhands, had gone pale. "You talked about her constantly. Every memory, every opinion she ever had, you shared with me. I just gave them back to you." Sheriff Dalton produced handcuffs with the solemnity of a man performing a distasteful but necessary duty. "Thomas Whitmore, you're under arrest for attempted fraud and poisoning. You have the right to remain silent." "Wait," Ezra said, standing with Doc Brennan's help. "Before you take him, I need to know something. Tom, was any of it real? Did you ever actually care about me? About the farm? About our family?" Tom looked at his uncle, and for a moment the mask dropped entirely. The pharmacist saw what was underneath. Not evil exactly, but an emptiness, a hollow place where family feelings should have lived. "I needed the money," Tom said simply. "My debts in Topeka. They were going to kill me, Uncle. Actually kill me. The farm was my only chance." The sheriff led Tom away, the crowd parting like water. Some followed, eager for more drama, but most dispersed slowly, quietly, processing what they'd witnessed. The pharmacist found himself standing with Ezra, Doc Brennan, and Ruby, who'd appeared from nowhere with a thermos of coffee. "What happens now?" Ruby asked, pouring coffee into paper cups she'd somehow produced. Ezra accepted the coffee with shaking hands. "Now I mourn my wife properly, without chemicals, without false comfort. Just grief, I suppose." "Real grief. Real grief is better than false joy," Doc Brennan said softly, and they all knew he was speaking from experience. The pharmacist thought about the 3 days of silence Ezra had endured, the confusion and abandonment he must have felt when Martha's voice disappeared. It had been cruel, perhaps, but less cruel than letting the deception continue until everything was lost. "I owe you an apology," Ezra said, turning to the pharmacist. "And probably payment for 6 months of phosphates I shouldn't have been drinking." "The phosphates were medicine, in their way," the pharmacist replied. "They gave you what you needed to survive Martha's loss. It's not your fault someone poisoned the cure." 2 days after the courthouse confrontation, Tom Whitmore returned to Millbrook. Sheriff Dalton had released him on bail pending a full investigation, and the county prosecutor was still deciding what charges to file. Our pharmacist learned of his return when the doorbell chimed at closing time, and Tom's silhouette appeared against the frosted glass like a storm cloud gathering strength. The pharmacist's hand moved instinctively toward the telephone, but Tom raised both hands in a gesture of surrender. "I'm not here to threaten, just to talk. To explain, maybe." Listen to the sound of desperation, the slight crack in Tom's voice, the nervous tapping of his fingers against his thigh, the shallow breathing of a man watching his carefully constructed world collapse. He looked different. The slick hair was unkempt, the pressed suit replaced with a wrinkled shirt and work pants that might have belonged to his uncle. "The sheriff says you have enough evidence to send me to prison," Tom continued, moving closer to the counter but keeping his hands visible. "The journal, the botanical tests, the Jimson weed samples. Very thorough." The pharmacist remained behind his counter, that familiar barrier between him and the unpredictable public. "You poisoned a good man for money. What explanation could possibly suffice?" Tom laughed, but it was hollow, echoing in the empty store. "Have you ever owed money to the wrong people? Not banks or legitimate creditors, but the kind of men who break fingers first and ask questions later?" "No," the pharmacist admitted. "I had a business in Topeka, importing and selling farm equipment. Everything was going well until the drought of '45. Farmers couldn't pay, I couldn't pay my suppliers, so I borrowed from people my legitimate creditors wouldn't touch. $20,000 at 30% monthly interest. Do you know what that becomes after 6 months?" The pharmacist did the calculation quickly. "More than you could ever repay." "More than I could ever repay," Tom agreed. "They gave me 2 choices, find the money or find a deep hole to die in." Then I remembered Uncle Ezra, sitting on 2,000 acres of prime Kansas farmland, alone and grieving. Outside, the evening wind picked up, rattling the prescription bottles on their shelves like bones in a fortune-teller's cup. The pharmacist noticed Tom's hands were shaking slightly, not from drugs or withdrawal, but from something simpler: fear. "So you decided to poison him slowly, take his farm, pay your debts." "I didn't plan the poison initially," Tom said, and for once he seemed to be telling the truth. "I came here thinking I could convince him normally, help with the farm, prove myself worthy of inheritance. But he was so lost in grief, barely functional. He'd sit in Martha's chair for hours, talking to empty air, begging her to answer him." The pharmacist remembered those early days after Martha's death, when Ezra would come to the drugstore seeking sleeping drafts and nerve tonics, anything to quiet the silence in his house.
Tom continued. "One day, I found him in the barn with my grandfather's old revolver, talking about joining Martha. That's when I remembered the Jimson weed growing behind the barn, remembered stories about shamans using it to speak with spirits. I told myself I was helping him." "You told yourself a comfortable lie," the pharmacist said. "Yes," Tom admitted, "but it worked." He heard Martha's voice, found purpose again. He started eating, sleeping, taking care of the farm. The fact that Martha's advice happened to align with my needs, that was just fortunate timing." The pharmacist studied the younger man, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time. Not a master manipulator, but a desperate amateur, improvising his way through a scheme that had spiraled beyond his control. "You could have stopped," the pharmacist said. "When his health improved, you could have gradually reduced the dose, let him recover naturally." "I tried once," Tom said quietly, "about 2 months ago. Reduced the powder by half. Uncle became suicidal again within days, so I increased it back. Told myself I was keeping him alive." They were interrupted by footsteps on the sidewalk. Doc Brennan entered, followed by Ruby and, surprisingly, Ezra Whitmore himself. The old man looked at his nephew with an expression that wasn't quite anger, wasn't quite pity, but something more complex, the look of someone trying to reconcile two incompatible truths. "Tom," Ezra said simply. "Uncle, Sheriff Dalton sent me to fetch you," Doc Brennan interrupted. "There's been a development. A man from Topeka arrived an hour ago. Says he represents your creditors." Tom's face went white. "They found me. He's at the sheriff's office," Doc Brennan continued. "Says if you don't come voluntarily, they have other ways of collecting." The pharmacist watched Tom process this information, watched him realize that prison might actually be the safer option. It was Ruby who spoke what they were all thinking. "You could confess," she said to Tom. "Full confession. Throw yourself on the mercy of the court. Prison time, but you'd be alive and protected." Tom looked at his uncle. "Would you testify against me?" Ezra was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands gripping the counter for support. "You gave me 6 months with Martha, even if she wasn't real. You also tried to steal everything my family built. I don't know how to balance those scales." The pharmacist felt the weight of the moment, the intersection of justice and mercy that defined small-town life. In the city, Tom would already be processed, charged, imprisoned. But here, in Millbrook, they still had to look each other in the eye at the general store, still had to share the same church pews and diner counters. "There's another option," the pharmacist said slowly, an idea forming. "Tom could sign a full confession, agree to work the farm under supervision for 5 years, with all profits going to Ezra. After 5 years, if he's proven trustworthy, he gets a small stake and a clean slate. The creditors get nothing, because Tom owns nothing. Indentured servitude,
Doc Brennan observed. "Very 1800s of you." "Biblical, actually," Ezra corrected. 7 years of labor for forgiveness of debts, though we'll call it 5. Tom looked between them, calculating. "The creditors won't just give up. They will if you're penniless and under constant sheriff supervision," Sheriff Dalton said from the doorway. None of them had heard him enter. "Can't squeeze blood from a stone, and they're practical men. They'll write you off and move on to easier targets." The pharmacist watched Tom wrestle with the option. 5 years of hard labor under the eye of the uncle he'd betrayed, or take his chances with either prison or the creditors. It wasn't much of a choice, but it was more than he deserved. "I'll need protection," Tom said finally.
"At least for the first few months."
"You'll have it," Sheriff Dalton assured him, "though you'll be earning it. Ever mucked out a barn at 4 in the morning? Because that's your new schedule." As they prepared to leave for the sheriff's office, Ezra turned to the pharmacist. "Thank you for the silence. Those 3 days without Martha's voice. They were agony, but they were necessary. Like Doc Brennan withdrawing from morphine. Sometimes the cure hurts worse than the disease." The pharmacist nodded, watching them file out into the October evening. The investigation that followed was thorough in the way of small-town justice, where everyone knew everyone and secrets were currency. Our pharmacist found himself at the center of it, his journal serving as the primary evidence, his testimony carrying the weight of professional authority. Sheriff Dalton commandeered the back room of the drugstore for interviews, and for 3 days, the pharmacy became an unofficial courthouse.
Listen to the rhythm of truth being extracted. The scratch of the sheriff's pencil on legal pad. The creak of the wooden chair as witnesses shifted uncomfortably. The soft clink of coffee cups that Ruby kept filled from her endless thermos. Each person who entered had a piece of the story. And slowly, like a photograph developing in chemical bath, the full picture emerged. Mrs. Hutchins testified about the lights she'd seen, the strange hours Tom kept, the sudden change in Ezra's behavior after his nephew arrived. "I thought it was grief at first," she admitted, "but then he started being too happy, talking about Martha like she was standing right there. Gave me the shivers." Jimmy Mueller, brave in his 12-year-old earnestness, described the daily phosphate runs, how Tom had specifically instructed him never to taste the drink, never to vary the schedule. He said it was medicine, that Mr. Whitmore needed it exactly at 8:15 or it wouldn't work. Doc Brennan provided the medical testimony, explaining Datura's effects with the precision of someone who understood altered consciousness intimately. At the doses Tom was administering, Ezra would have experienced mild auditory hallucinations, increased suggestibility, and memory gaps. Perfect for manipulation, but not enough to trigger obvious medical symptoms that might have raised alarms. The surprise witness was a telegram from the pharmacist's colleague in Kansas City confirming the analysis of the powder sample he'd sent. Datura stramonium, definitely. Concentration approximately 15%, mixed with calcium carbonate and milk powder. Whoever prepared this knew their chemistry. Tom, working under supervision at the farm, was brought in for formal questioning. He'd lost weight in just 3 days, the physical labor and guilt carving new lines in his face. His confession was detailed, methodical, almost relieved. "I researched for weeks," he admitted. "Read everything in the library about plant-based hallucinogens.
Jimson weed was perfect, grew naturally on the property, easy to prepare, predictable effects. I started with tiny doses, increased gradually, kept detailed notes about what worked. Sheriff Dalton produced a notebook they'd found in Tom's room, pages of observations about Ezra's reactions, optimal dosing times, even scripts for what Martha should say. The morning ritual was crucial, Tom explained. 8:15 was when the previous day's dose was wearing off, when he was most susceptible. I'd whisper suggestions while he drank, things Martha might say. Within an hour, he'd be hearing her voice, clear as day. The pharmacist asked the question that had been bothering him. The phosphate itself, why that particular drink? Tom almost smiled.
Uncle mentioned once that Martha loved phosphates, that their first date was at a soda fountain in Wichita. I knew he'd never refuse something connected to that memory. It was a detail so calculating, yet somehow pitiful that the room fell silent. Even Sheriff Dalton, veteran of 20 years of law enforcement, seemed affected by the casual cruelty of weaponizing love. The revelation that broke the case wide open came from an unexpected source. A banker from Topeka, one of the legitimate creditors Tom had fled, arrived with documents showing Tom had attempted a similar scheme before. An elderly aunt in Missouri who'd suddenly changed her will after experiencing visions of her deceased husband. That case had fallen apart when the aunt's daughter insisted on medical examination. Pattern of behavior, Sheriff Dalton noted. This wasn't desperation, it was methodology. But it was Ezra's testimony that carried the most weight, delivered with the quiet dignity of someone who'd survived betrayal and emerged oddly grateful. For 6 months, I lived in a beautiful lie, he said. I woke each morning knowing I'd hear Martha's voice, feel her presence. It was like she'd never died, just stepped into another room where I could still reach her. When the voices stopped, when our pharmacist here substituted the powder, I wanted to die myself. The silence was unbearable. He paused, looking directly at Tom, who couldn't meet his eyes. But then I realized something. The real Martha would never have told me to sign away the farm. She loved this land more than anything except maybe me. She would have told me to plant winter wheat, fix the barn roof, maybe take on a young partner to help with the work, but never to give it away. That's how I knew, even before learning about the poison. The fake Martha was too agreeable, too aligned with what Tom wanted. The real Martha was stubborn as prairie grass. The county prosecutor, who'd driven down from Topeka, laid out the charges: attempted fraud, poisoning with intent to harm, exploitation of a vulnerable adult. With the Missouri evidence and the pattern of behavior, Tom was looking at 15 to 20 years in state prison. It was then that Ezra did something unexpected. He stood, faced the prosecutor, and said, "I want to propose an alternative." The room stirred with surprise. The prosecutor, a thin man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, adjusted his glasses. "Mr. Whitmore, this is a serious criminal matter." "It's my life that was affected," Ezra replied. "My farm, my grief, my poisoning. Don't I have a say in the justice?" What followed was negotiation in the way of small towns, where formal law bent to accommodate human complexity. Ezra proposed his work release program, 5 years of supervised farm labor, with Tom's work paying off his debts and compensating the estate. Any violation would trigger the full criminal prosecution. "You're asking me to ignore attempted murder," the prosecutor said. "I'm asking you to recognize that prison won't fix him," Ezra countered, "but 5 years of honest work might. Plus,
The state saves the cost of a trial and incarceration. The pharmacist watched this play out with mixed feelings. Part of him wanted Tom punished fully, locked away where he couldn't hurt anyone else. But another part, the part that had dispensed mercy along with medicine for years, understood Ezra's position. Doc Brennan spoke up. From a medical perspective, Tom shows signs of personality disorder, possibly sociopathic tendencies. But he's also young, intelligent, capable of learning. Supervised rehabilitation might be more effective than prison. The prosecutor gathered his papers, clearly frustrated but recognizing the town's united front. I'll present this to the judge. But if he violates any terms, even once, the full charges will be filed. As the meeting dispersed, the pharmacist found himself alone with Sheriff Dalton, who was packing up his temporary office. "You did the right thing," the sheriff said, "substituting the powder. Could have gone bad a dozen different ways, but you read it correctly." The pharmacist thought about those 3 days of silence Ezra had endured, the risk of Tom discovering the substitution, the ethical lines he'd crossed and recrossed. "Sometimes there is no right thing," he replied. 3 weeks had passed since the courthouse revelation, and November had settled over Millbrook like a gray wool blanket. Our pharmacist stood at his window, watching the first snow of the season dust Main Street with pristine white that would turn to muddy slush by noon. The town had absorbed the scandal of the Whitmore affair the way it absorbed all disruptions, with initial shock, furious gossip, then gradual acceptance that this too was part of life's strange tapestry. Listen to the sounds of a small town healing, the bell above the door chiming with regular customers, the hiss of the coffee percolator Ruby had insisted on installing behind the counter, the gentle fizz of phosphates being mixed for the after-school crowd. Life had returned to its rhythm, but with subtle changes, like a familiar song played in a different key. Ezra Whitmore entered at his new regular time, 10 in the morning, no longer enslaved to 8:15 appointments with ghost voices. He looked healthier, having gained back some weight, though his eyes carried a permanent sadness that no amount of time would fully erase. "The usual?" the pharmacist asked, though Ezra's usual had changed. Now it was simple black coffee with a shot of vanilla syrup. Martha's favorite, he said, but without the chemical enhancement. "Tom's learning," Ezra said, settling onto a stool at the counter. "Slow, but he's learning. Yesterday he managed to repair the combine without cursing once. Progress." The arrangement had been formalized by the judge, 5 years of supervised labor, with Tom living in the old farmhands' quarters, 100 yards from the main house, close enough to watch, far enough to maintain boundaries. Sheriff Dalton checked in twice weekly, and Tom wore an ankle monitor that would alert authorities if he left the property without permission. "Any more trouble from the Topeka creditors?" the pharmacist asked. "They sent 2 men last week. Tom was mucking out the barn, covered in manure and sweat. They took one look at him, at the sheriff's deputy standing guard, at the nothing he owned, and left." "Guess they decided he wasn't worth the effort." Doc Brennan entered, steady on his feet, eyes clear. His voluntary admission to the State Medical Board had resulted in a 90-day suspension, but with provision for supervised practice afterward. He'd been spending his suspension time reading medical journals and helping at the county free clinic, rediscovering why he'd become a doctor in the first place. "Ezra, how's the heart?" Doc asked, pulling up a stool. "Still beating irregularly, but that's nothing new. At least now I can feel it without wondering if it's real or another hallucination." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment.
Three men who'd weathered a strange storm together. Ruby emerged from behind the counter with fresh coffee, having appointed herself unofficial manager of the pharmacy's new social aspect. "Mrs. Hutchins is telling everyone you're a hero," she informed the pharmacist.
"Says you saved Ezra's life and probably prevented a murder." The pharmacist shook his head. "I just recognized a smell. Hardly heroic." "You risked your reputation, your business," Ezra corrected. "Tom could have destroyed you with rumors. That took courage." The pharmacist thought about courage, about the different forms it took. There was Doc Brennan's courage in confronting his addiction, Ruby's courage in building a life after loss, Ezra's courage in choosing rehabilitation over revenge for his nephew. Even Tom, in his twisted way, had shown courage in accepting hard labor over running from his debts. "I've been thinking about Martha," Ezra said suddenly. "The real Martha, not the voice Tom created. She would have found this whole situation amusing, in a dark way. She always said I was too trusting, too willing to believe what I wanted to hear." "We all have our phosphates," Doc Brennan observed, echoing the pharmacist's earlier words. "Things we drink down because they make reality more bearable. The difference," the pharmacist added, "is whether we choose our phosphates or have them chosen for us." The afternoon crowd began arriving. School children seeking penny candy, farmers needing veterinary supplies, housewives collecting prescriptions. The pharmacist moved between them with practiced efficiency, but his mind kept returning to the journal he'd been keeping, now expanded beyond mere pharmaceutical records to include observations on human nature, on the delicate balance between help and harm. That evening, as he prepared to close, he found Tom Whitmore at his door. The younger man was transformed by 3 weeks of farm labor, hands calloused, shoulders broader, the city's slickness completely worn away. "Sheriff says I can come to town once a week for supplies," Tom explained. "I wanted to apologize." "Properly." The pharmacist studied him, looking for signs of manipulation, but found only exhaustion and something that might have been genuine remorse. "I've been reading," Tom continued. "Uncle has books on agriculture, history, philosophy. There's one by Marcus Aurelius, 'What we do now echoes in eternity.' I poisoned my uncle for money, and that echo will never stop, will it?" "No," the pharmacist agreed, "but you can change its tone. 5 years of honest work might not erase the poison, but it could dilute it." Tom nodded, then surprised him by asking, "Do you think people can really change? Or are we fixed, like chemical compounds, unable to be anything but what we are?" It was a question the pharmacist had been pondering himself. He thought about the Jimson weed growing behind the Whitmore barn. Poisonous, yes, but also medicinal in the right hands at the right dose. He thought about Doc Brennan, transforming his addiction into advocacy for other struggling physicians. He thought about Ruby, teaching herself bookkeeping from library texts, planning to open her own restaurant someday. "I think," he said carefully, "that people are more like solutions than compounds. We can be diluted, concentrated, mixed with other elements. The base nature remains, but the expression changes." Tom seemed to consider this, then pulled out a small notebook. "I've been documenting everything. Not like before, not manipulation, just observations. What I did, why I did it, what I'm learning. Maybe someday it could help someone else avoid my mistakes." After Tom left, the pharmacist stood in his empty store, surrounded by bottles of cures and poisons, many of them the same substance in different doses. He thought about the letter he'd received that morning,
from the Kansas City College of Pharmacy, inviting him to lecture on the ethical implications of the Whitmore case. Outside, snow was falling more heavily now, covering the town in temporary perfection. Tomorrow it would melt or turn to mud, but tonight it was pure, untouched, full of possibility. He pulled out his journal and began to write. November 1947. The Whitmore case is concluded, though its ripples continue. I've learned that the greatest poisons are often those we administer to ourselves: grief, desperation, the need to believe comfortable lies. But I've also learned that truth, while sometimes painful as withdrawal, is the only genuine cure. The drugstore has become more than a pharmacy. It's a confession booth, a courthouse, a place where the town's wounds are displayed and gradually healed. Ruby has suggested we add more tables, make it a proper soda fountain again. I think Martha Whitmore would have approved. Ezra takes his coffee black now, with just that splash of vanilla. He says he talks to Martha still, but honestly now, in the silence of memory, rather than the false voices of chemistry. Tom works the farm with increasing competence, his debt to society measured in bushels of wheat and hours of labor. Doc Brennan returns to practice next month, humbled but renewed. He plans to specialize in addiction treatment, turning his weakness into wisdom. The state medical board was surprisingly understanding. Perhaps they recognize that wounded healers often heal best. As for me, I continue to dispense medicines and sodas, advice and silence as needed. The Jimson weed has been cleared from behind the Whitmore barn, burned in a pile that sent sweet smoke across the prairie. But I kept some seeds locked in my poison cabinet. A reminder that the line between medicine and malice is often just a matter of measurement. Tomorrow, young Jimmy Mueller starts his apprenticeship here. He wants to be a pharmacist, he says, wants to learn the mysteries of mortar and pestle, the alchemy of healing. I'll teach him chemistry, certainly, but more importantly, I'll teach him to recognize the smell of deception, the weight of responsibility, the terrible and wonderful power we hold when people trust us with their pain. The snow continues to fall. Millbrook sleeps under its white blanket, and somewhere, I'm certain, Martha Whitmore sleeps too, finally at peace, no longer summoned by false prophets or chemical incantations. And that, perhaps, is the most honest phosphate of all, the silence that lets the dead rest and the living continue, carrying their griefs and hopes forward into whatever tomorrow brings.